The 9,940th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Maintenance of Peace and Security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Germany, Italy, Lithuania, Norway, Poland, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Miroslav Yencha, Assistant Secretary General for Europe, Central Asia and Americas, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Ms. Edem Wassernou, Director of Operations and Advocacy, Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Miroslav Yencha.
Madam President, since we last briefed this Council on developments in Ukraine 3 weeks ago, fighting has continued to intensify on the ground, enveloping new geographic areas and prompting further displacement of the civilian population. We have witnessed unrelenting large-scale Russian aerial attacks on Ukrainian cities and towns, resulting in a significant rise in civilian casualties. On the night of 16-17 June, Russian drones and missiles hit 7 districts in Kyiv, killing at least 28 civilians and injuring more than 130 others. This was one of the deadliest attacks on the capital in nearly a year. According to the State Emergency Service of Ukraine, rescue workers spent all night trying to rescue dozens of trapped residents from under partially destroyed 9-story residential building that had reportedly been hit by a Russian ballistic missile. Many people are still reported missing under the rubble of the 35 apartments destroyed that night. This is the story of just one residential building in one neighborhood of one city. That night, Odessa, Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, Zhytomyr, Kirovohrad, Mykolaiv, and Kyiv Oblast were also reportedly attacked with over 428 drones and missiles. In Odessa, 2 civilians were reportedly killed and scores injured. These levels of death and destruction risk dimming hope for an immediate ceasefire and threaten to undermine prospects for a lasting peace. Madam President, according to OHCHR, since the start of Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, at least 13,438 civilians, including 713 children, have been killed. The confirmed number of civilians injured stands at 33,279, including 2,092 children. The first 5 months of 2025 alone, the number of civilian casualties in Ukraine totaled 5,144, with 859 killed and 4,285 injured. This figure was 47% higher than in the same period in 2024. This dramatic increase is a result of intensified use of long-range weapons, both missiles and loitering munitions, against cities across Ukraine. According to Ukrainian authorities, between 1 and 17 June 2025, Russian armed forces launched at least 3,340 long-range drones, including loitering munitions and decoy drones, and 135 missiles into Ukraine. By comparison, 544 long-range munitions were launched during the entire month of June 2024. Madam President, escalating violence impacting civilians also continues to be reported, albeit at a far lower level in bordering regions of the Russian Federation. On 17 June, local authorities reported that a woman living near the border with Ukraine in Russia's Kursk region died at the hospital a day after she was injured in a Ukrainian drone attack. In another incident reported by the local authorities on 9 June, a 60-year-old man was reportedly killed and 5 others were injured in a Ukrainian strike on a recreational center in the Kursk region. The United Nations is not able to verify these reports. Let me once again unequivocally state attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law wherever they occur. We condemn all such attacks. They must cease immediately. My colleague, Director Vosornu of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, will provide updates about the impacts on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. Madam President, since our last briefing, important diplomatic developments have taken place on the challenging path towards a lasting peace in Ukraine. On 2 June, Ukrainian and Russian delegations held their second face-to-face meeting in Istanbul, where they reportedly exchanged written memoranda outlining their respective visions for a ceasefire and parameters for a future peace settlement. The talks also resulted in an agreement for large-scale exchanges of prisoners of war and of mortal remains, as well as civilian detainees. The exchanges have been carried out in phases in the weeks since then. Earlier today, the latest round of exchanges of severely sick and wounded took place. It followed several rounds of all-for-all exchanges of youth of 25 years and younger, started on 9 June. Further exchanges are expected. As of 16 June, the mortal remains of 6,057 Ukrainian service persons and 78 Russian service persons were also reportedly returned by the sides. We welcome these exchanges and encourage them to continue so that all remaining prisoners of war and civilian detainees soon return home. These efforts provide answers to many families who have lived in uncertainty about their loved ones, reunite prisoners of war and civilian detainees with their families, and allow those who have been subjected to dire conditions in captivity to return to safety. Madam President, we welcome the continuation of all meaningful diplomatic efforts, including the recent talks in Istanbul. We urge the sides to make tangible progress towards a ceasefire and a lasting settlement through continued talks. The United Nations position remains principled in support of a just and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions, and of Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The Secretary General has called for a complete, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire as an important first step to that end. As we are facing renewed escalation on the ground and crisis elsewhere, It is critical to maintain focused attention on the urgent need for peace in Ukraine. We must redouble the efforts to ensure that the fragile diplomatic process is not only sustained, but becomes irreversible. The United Nations stands ready to support all meaningful efforts to that end. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Yencha for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Ursunu.
Thank you, Madam President. I welcome the opportunity to brief the Council on Ukraine today, alongside with Assistant Secretary General Yencha. Since OCHA briefed the Security Council just 3 weeks ago, civilians, as you've heard, have found no respite from continuing violence. Daily waves of missile and drone strikes continue to exact a devastating toll, particularly in the front lines. These attacks have led to rising civilian casualties, widespread property destruction, and growing displacement. As ASG Yencha has mentioned, a combined drone and missile attack overnight between 16 and 17 June was reportedly Kiev's deadliest in nearly a year, killing over 24 civilians and injuring more than 100. Ukrainian authorities have also reported finding evidence of the use of cluster munitions, as you've heard. Residential buildings and critical infrastructure across the city were damaged or destroyed. In Odessa, attacks reportedly injured multiple civilians and damaged a kindergarten and a center for children with special needs, places that should offer safety and protection. In Zaporizhia, strikes on residential areas have terrorized families in their own homes. Hostilities in the frontline regions of Kherson, Kharkiv, and Donetsk, as well as the border areas of Sumy, continue to cause extensive damage and displacement. Communities in these regions, again, traumatized, exhausted, and rapidly running out of resources as relentless attacks destroy homes and livelihoods. Madam President, civilians continue to bear the severe consequences of this war. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission, again as highlighted in Ukraine, reports that long-range missiles and drones have significantly contributed to high levels of civilian casualties across the country this year. Nearly 50% more civilians have been killed and injured in Ukraine in the first 5 months of 2025 than during the same period in 24. The UN Mine Action Service estimates that over 20% of Ukraine's land is contaminated by mines or unexploded ordnance, making it the most heavily contaminated country since World War II. Demining efforts to clear agricultural land, led by the government of Ukraine and supported by humanitarian partners, enable families to safely return to farming and rebuild their livelihoods. However, given the current levels of contamination, these efforts are expected to continue for many years. Humanitarian workers also face growing threats. So far in 2025, 68 incidents of violence impacted humanitarian personnel, assets, and facilities have been recorded. 2 aid workers have been killed and 24 have been injured while delivering assistance. Additionally, unverified reports indicate civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure in the Kursk and Belgorod regions of the Russian Federation. As we have consistently emphasized, under international humanitarian law, constant care must be taken to spare civilians. Again, ASG and has highlighted that, including, of course, humanitarian workers and civilian objects, including homes, schools, and humanitarian assets. The reported use of anti-personnel landmines and cluster munitions is of special concern because of their notorious indiscriminate and long-term effects. These weapons must be relegated to the past. Furthermore, in light of recent announcements to withdraw from anti-personnel mine ban convention, the Secretary General recalled this week that when civilians face heightened risks from widening conflicts, it is imperative that we strengthen the frameworks that protect human life and dignity. We will persist in our engagement with parties and member states to this effect. Madam President, as the war continues, millions of lives are impacted every day. Essential services are disrupted and vulnerabilities are deepening for nearly 13 million people in need of assistance. About 3.7 million people remain internally displaced, including 60,000 newly displaced from frontline regions since January this year alone. There are almost 6 million Ukrainians registered as refugees globally, mainly in Europe. Amid intensifying hostilities, the government of Ukraine continues to decree the mandatory evacuation of families with children from frontline villages, most recently in the Kharkiv region. However, for some people living in these regions, attacks are so frequent that evacuations themselves become a risky prospect. It will be important to help humanitarians find ways to address the needs of these people, this population as well. You've heard us say this before, women and children, as in many crises around the world, are disproportionately impacted, especially in displacement settings. Sexual violence has been documented throughout the year, yet healthcare facilities and safe spaces in rural areas affected by the war are often ill-equipped to respond to survivors. Essential women's rights and survivor-led organizations operate on limited funding. We remain unable to reach an estimated 1.5 million civilians requiring humanitarian assistance in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, Zaporizhzhia regions under occupation by the Russian Federation. International humanitarian law demands that the parties facilitate the rapid and unimpeded access of humanitarian relief for civilians in need wherever they are. Madam President, despite an operating environment beset by multiple risks and serious challenges, humanitarians operations in Ukraine continue to forge ahead, and humanitarians remain committed, humanitarians remain engaged. In the first 5 months of 2025 alone, over 450 humanitarian organizations, largely national NGOs, reached an estimated 3.4 million people with life-saving assistance. Aid delivery has focused on providing food and livelihood support, emergency water, essential medicines, and emergency health services. The objective is to reach those most at risk and most in need, centering on 4 core response priorities. 1, people near the front line. 2, evacuations. 3, emergency response after strikes, and aid to the most vulnerable among the internally displaced people. We thank donors for their generosity, and thanks to them, some $816 million or 31% of the $2.6 billion needed for the 2025 Ukrainian humanitarian needs and response plan has been secured. Timely financial support is vital to ensure humanitarian operations can continue for the most in need. Madam President, I conclude by renewing our calls earlier to this Council for urgent collective action on Ukraine. First, protect civilians, including humanitarian and health workers, and safeguard civilian infrastructure. Ensure safe, rapid, unimpeded humanitarian access to all civilians in need. Second, sustain financial support. Declining funding trends are forcing programs to close, even as the operational context remains volatile and grows more complex and dangerous. Additional resources are urgently needed to save lives and prepare for the winter. Third, end this war, and until then, ensure that humanitarian concerns are a central part of discussions on a pause in fighting or longer-term agreement. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wisarnu for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving me the floor, and thank you for convening this meeting. I wish to end my thanks to ASG and Director Wisarnu for their briefings. Madam President, since our last meeting, we have been witnessing a relentless barrage of drones and missiles on Ukrainian cities. Night after night, civilians throughout the country are suffering the consequences of the ongoing aggression. In less than 6 months, Russia used hundreds of missiles and over 20,000 drones. These attacks culminated this week with Russia's aerial strikes on Kyiv. The massive aerial attack hit densely populated neighborhoods and critical civilian infrastructure. With over 100 civilians killed or injured, it was the deadliest attack on the capital of Ukraine in almost a year. Madam President, throughout the last year, this war has been escalating at an accelerated pace. As Director Vosorno said in her briefing, nearly 50% more civilians have been killed or injured in the first 5 months of this year than during the same period in 2024. To illustrate, in the attack on Kiev last Tuesday, Russia used almost 500 munitions in a single night. Last year, Russia used approximately the same amount throughout the whole month of June. These attacks are an obvious violation of international humanitarian law, and Slovenia condemns them in the strongest possible terms. All of this is occurring while diplomatic efforts to ensure a just and lasting peace in Ukraine are underway. These attacks are not only a display of bad faith in midst of negotiations, they are an expression of unwillingness to compromise, an attempt to intimidate until maximalist terms are accepted, terms that would tear the very fabric of the UN Charter. Madam President, while we welcome all diplomatic efforts toward a just and lasting peace in Ukraine, the results of contacts between Ukraine and Russia to date are underwhelming, to say the least. Russia keeps meeting Ukraine's efforts toward a ceasefire with missiles and drones. We are confident that today, in this chamber, we will once again hear a nearly united voice, a voice unwavering in its call for a ceasefire, a voice that says the time is now. We're waiting for just one more to join. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President. And let me also thank Assistant Secretary General Jenča and OCHA Director Vosorno for their briefings. Madam President, we convene today because Ukraine has endured another 3 weeks of death, destruction, and misery under a relentless blitz of drones, missiles, and bombs. After tens of thousands of Ukrainian civilian casualties in this illegal aggression, it becomes ever harder to single out an individual attack. Nevertheless, the air attacks overnight on 17 June were especially savage. As we've heard, that night, a reported 440 drones and 30 missiles were fired at Ukraine's cities. Kyiv bore the brunt. At least 24 civilians were killed and 134 injured. And last night, Odessa was once again hit by Russian drones, with reports of at least 1 civilian killed and 14 injured. As we speak, rescuers are searching the rubble for survivors. These direct hits by drones and cruise missiles on high-rise residential blocks further undermine Russia's claims that its armed forces only attack military targets. We convey our condolences to the people of Ukraine, a country once again in mourning to remember the latest civilians killed in this illegal war of aggression. Russia's air attacks came as G7 leaders were gathered in Canada to discuss the war, with repeated calls for Russia to accept Ukraine's offer of an immediate, unconditional, and complete 30-day ceasefire. It has long been clear, while Ukraine is ready for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire and substantial peace talks, Russia plays for time and continues its senseless war with undiminished ferocity. Madam President, actions speak louder than words. Over the last 3 weeks, Russia has chosen to act in the most cynical way, both in pursuing its full-scale invasion in Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter, but also here in the Security Council. From conveying history-distorting area formula meetings to proposing multiple council products in bad faith. These are nothing more than attempts aimed once again to distract the Council from a simple truth, that Russia is continuing its illegal war of aggression against a peaceful neighboring country. Madam President, Ukraine has repeatedly offered an immediate, unconditional, and complete 30-day ceasefire. We call on Russia to accept this offer and to do so now. Denmark will continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes as it fights to achieve a just, sustainable, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. We are grateful to Guyana for convening this meeting. At the outset, I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Mr. Yencho and Director Ms. Vosornou for their informative yet worrying briefings. Madam President, this war needs to stop. Instead of genuinely embarking on the path to peace through negotiations initiated by the United States, Russia strayed from it and has intensified its attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, causing immense human suffering and leading to further regional and global destabilization. In the context of another countrywide assault, Russia launched on June 17th the deadliest attack in Kyiv in almost a year, causing at least 28 deaths. The total verified figures are gruesome and incontrovertible. Russian attacks have caused 50% more casualties in the first month of 2025 than the same period last year. Civilian infrastructure is constantly targeted, with residential buildings, schools, health facilities and port infrastructure sustaining substantial damage. We deplore any attacks against civilians and civilian objects. We commend once more the work of OCHA and other humanitarian organizations active in Ukraine, and we are calling for the full, safe and unimpeded access to the areas where the work is most needed. Madam President, the world is watching events unfold in Ukraine. The overwhelming majority of UN members have repeatedly condemned Russia's war of choice against Ukraine. We need to collectively discourage imitators of this aggression and reject in practice the idiom that might makes right. Greece insists on the need for accountability for the perpetrators of violations of international humanitarian law and justice for the victims. In that respect, we commend the work of international judicial institutions and stress the latest striking findings of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Madam President, Greece has welcomed recent peace efforts, which led to 2 rounds of direct bilateral talks between the sides. We also welcome the exchange of prisoners of war, captives under the age of 25, and fallen soldiers, which was agreed bilaterally as a sign of progress. Yet what is needed is not to treat the symptom but the disease, and this can only be done by putting an immediate end to the hostilities that led to this. What we need now is peace. No peace effort can have any substantial result if hostilities continue. We regret the fact that both rounds have confirmed the significant distance between the 2 sides and that Ukraine's willingness to agree to an immediate ceasefire was not reciprocated by Russia. We call on Russia to heed the calls of the majority of the international community and make the decisive first step to agree on a full, immediate and unconditional ceasefire on the path towards a just, comprehensive and lasting peace in line with international law, the UN Charter, and in full respect of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Madam President, in closing, let me stress that peace in Ukraine can only be sustained by credible and robust security guarantees, which will deter and prevent the recurrence of war in the future, and with the active engagement of the international community, as the security of Ukraine is inextricably intertwined with global security and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to begin by thanking the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations for Europe, Central Asia, America, and the Americas, Mr. Miroslav Jenka, and the Director of Operations and Advocacy of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Edem Vosornou, for their briefings and also for the UN's action to help the victims of this war. Madam President, irrespective of its rhetoric, Russia's objective hasn't changed and remains to subjugate Ukraine. Russia doesn't want peace. One need only observe its actions to see this. Since the last resolution of this Council calling for immediate peace that Russia voted for, this country has picked up with unprecedented intensity its bombardments against Ukraine. Let's begin with that. Rescuers found 23 dead in the rubble of the Solyansky district building in Kyiv that was struck by a Russian missile on the 17th of June. The images of the gutted building echo those of the buildings in Vinnytsia, Kramatorsk Station, the pediatric hospital in Kyiv, the print house in Kharkiv, a shopping center in Konstantinivka, a playground in Kryvyi Rih, or even a shopping street in Sumy. In total, The strikes on Kiev from Monday night to Tuesday resulted in 28 dead. These are some of the deadliest since the beginning of the Russian aggression on Ukraine that started on the 24th of February 2022. These deaths are no accident. They're not collateral damage from the destruction of military targets. Civilians are being deliberately targeted. They died because Russia is choosing to pursue a strategy of terror to try to bring Ukraine to its knees. They died because Russia's attacks on civilian infrastructure and the Ukrainian population are deliberately targeting densely populated urban areas. They died because Russia is blind to the heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people and thus violates international law. The Council must condemn these violations of IHL, must call Russia to bring an end to them, and must recall Russia's obligations under the Charter. Madam President, Russia continues to obstruct the ceasefire that Ukraine accepted over 100 days ago now, and that the entire international community is demanding. Its attitude at the two Istanbul meetings leaves no doubt as its true attitude to the opening of direct discussions. On the 16th of May, it sent a low-level delegation without negotiating power, even though the Ukrainian president proposed direct negotiations between heads of state. On the 2nd of June, with the same delegation, it sent a memorandum listing a series of leonine and maximalist conditions for a ceasefire. To stop the fighting, it's demanding that Ukraine either withdraw from its own regions that Russia is partially and illegally occupying, or comply with demands that would compromise its own security and its right to self-defense, which would a regime that would send us 23 years backwards. These conditions amount to demanding Ukraine's capitulation. They are not acceptable. The Council must recall tirelessly that peace, to be real, must be just and must, as is said in the Charter, respect the territorial integrity and independence of Ukraine. Madam President, today, as it did on the 7th of October 2023, Russia seeks to harness the escalation in the Middle East to distract attention from its aggression. On the one hand, it is intensifying deadly steps in Ukraine, and on the other, it is purporting in vain to play a role of mediator in the conflict between Israel and Iran. This fresh attempt to divert attention will fail like the previous ones. No global disorder will make us forget that Russia, by invading Ukraine, is violating the UN Charter and its fundamental principles, is challenging borders and threatening European security and global stability. Almost a year ago to the day, more than 100 countries were meeting in Switzerland in Burgenstock to jointly define the foundations of a fair and lasting peace. The Russian president, on the 14th of June 2024, already set Ukraine's surrender as a condition for these talks. As the General Assembly has emphasized unambiguously on multiple occasions, peace must be fair. That it means it must respect international law, sovereignty, and Ukraine's territorial integrity, and it must be lasting. Therefore, it must have robust security guarantees for Ukraine. France will continue to work for this peace alongside the Ukrainian people, who have always opted for peace despite the aggression that they are suffering. Madam President, to conclude, on the 24th of February, Russia voted in favour of Resolution 2774, through which the Council demanded an end to the conflict as soon as possible. What did Russia do after that vote? Well, it continued its attacks on Ukrainian territory with renewed intensity, some of which might represent war crimes. It reiterated its clear inflexibility in all of its objectives in Ukraine and has set maximalist conditions. It is high time for that to end. It is high time for Russia to implement what this Council has demanded and voted on. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I'd like to start by thanking ASG Yencha and Director Wasonu for their helpful briefings. Colleagues, we're convened here again in response to Russia's continuing and intensifying attacks against Ukraine. On the 11th of June, Russia struck a power station in Kherson, plunging the city into rolling blackouts and disrupting access to clean water. On the 15th of June, Russia reportedly damaged energy facilities in Poltava Oblast. And on the night of the 16th, 17th of June, Russia conducted a devastating assault on the city of Kyiv, the third largest nationwide strike of the war, raining hundreds of drones down on densely populated residential areas. The civilian death toll is at least 28, with hundreds injured, and we extend our condolences to all those affected. Attacks and civilian deaths have continued in the nights following. These attacks are not decreasing and they are not random. They're part of a deliberate and intensifying campaign of violence against civilian targets calculated to deepen the suffering of the Ukrainian people. On top of this, Russia continues to peddle false narratives, seeking to justify their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But there can be no justification for what they have done. It has been 101 days since Ukraine agreed to an unconditional ceasefire, and it's now reported that Russian military casualties have reached 1 million. These dreadful milestones keep piling up, and yet Russia shows no sign of stopping. While Ukraine has actively engaged in genuine steps towards peace, Russia has engaged in destruction. Meanwhile, President Putin poses as a mediator of peace in the Middle East. We don't need more false promises. We need genuine peace. So again, we call on Russia to comply with international law, including the UN Charter. We call on Russia to agree an unconditional ceasefire. Russia initiated this war. We call on Russia to end it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to extend my gratitude to ASG Yencha and OCHA Director Wasorno for their briefings. I also welcome the representative of Ukraine to today's meeting. As we meet today, Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine, which has continued for over 1,200 days, remains ongoing. During this prolonged and brutal conflict, more than 46,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed or injured. Furthermore, according to reports, Russian military casualties have surpassed 1 million. These are not merely horrific statistics. They represent lives lost, families devastated, and the continued erosion of human dignity in the face of relentless violence. 3 days ago, on Tuesday, Russia launched a massive barrage of drone and missile attacks on Kiev and other Ukrainian cities. They hit residential neighborhoods in Kiev, killing at least 28 civilians and injuring over 100 more. Let us again be clear, these deliberate, large-scale attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure constitute clear violations of international law and must be condemned in the strongest possible terms. Madam President, in the midst of these grave circumstances, we note that on June 3rd, Ukraine and Russia held their second round of direct talks in Istanbul. Both sides committed to a large-scale exchange of prisoners of war under the age of 25 and severely wounded ones, as well as the return of the remains of more than 6,000 fallen soldiers. While these talks did not produce any political or military breakthrough, they signaled the existence of a narrow but important humanitarian channel and some semblance of trust building. Ukraine has expressed its readiness for a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. What is needed is an immediate end to hostilities to prevent further unnecessary casualties on both sides. Madam President, despite our collective hope for this senseless war to end without further delay, we are witnessing troubling signs to the contrary. The continued build-up of Russian forces near the border is raising fears of a potential massive summer offensive. Adding more fuel or troops to the fire only serves to contradict any genuine will for a ceasefire. In this context, North Korea and Russia have intensified their illegal military cooperation, with yesterday marking the first anniversary of the signing of their so-called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. Russian top security official Shoigu has visited Pyongyang 3 times in the past 3 months. Following his most recent visit this week, Russia announced the plan to dispatch an additional 6,000 North Korean combat engineers and military construction workers to the Kursk region. Far from meeting the expectations of the international community, the continued illegal military cooperation between Russia and North Korea not only prolongs the conflict in Ukraine, but also increases security risks on the Korean Peninsula. By enabling North Korea's involvement in modern warfare and accelerating its military modernization. We express our grave concern over the ongoing unlawful cooperation between DPRK and Russia in a flagrant violation of Security Council resolutions. We call on Russia to immediately cease preparations for seemingly renewed aggression and to choose the path of genuine negotiations to end the war. In closing, Madam President, the longer this unforgiving war continues, the greater the damage not only to lives and livelihoods, but also to regional security, international peace, and the foundational principles of the UN Charter. We implore the international community to continue to push for an end to this senseless war. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you, ASG Miroslav Yencha and Director Edem Osornu for your briefings. And welcome to the representative of Ukraine. In the overnight hours of June 16 and 17, Russia launched one of the largest strikes against Ukraine's capital since the start of its full-scale invasion, including 440 drones and 32 missiles. The attack killed at least 24 people in Kyiv and injured at least 115 people. And I have noted that some here today have estimated even higher casualty numbers for killed and wounded. We join others in extending condolences for those lost. I can confirm that one of those killed was a U.S. citizen, the first American civilian to die in this war. The United States unequivocally condemns these brutal attacks, which have wreaked death and destruction on civilians. We have seen media reporting on video footage and impact assessments indicating Russia used cluster munitions. In this month alone, Russia has already launched more than 3,300 one-way attack drones and is on track to deploy nearly 6,000 killer drones. There is no justification for Russia's attacks on Ukraine's cities. Russia is killing Ukrainian civilians when it should be doing the exact opposite, ending the war. Russia must stop the killing of civilians and the destruction of their homes, schools, and playgrounds. It is now 116 days since this Council adopted a resolution imploring a swift end to the conflict and urging a lasting peace between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Russia's actions, however, oppose that goal. Today, we reiterate our call on Russia to negotiate in good faith toward a ceasefire and a lasting, durable peace. We urge all countries, including China, to stop exports to Russia of dual-use goods that contribute to Russia's war industrial base and enable its drone and missile attacks against Ukraine. We further condemn Iran for providing Russia with Shahed drones and missiles, and the DPRK for transferring to Russia munitions, missiles, and troops. These are prolonging the war and increasing suffering in both Ukraine and Russia. Russia must now turn toward peace. Enough is enough. End it now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank ASG Miroslav Yencha and OCHA Director Edem Vosornu for their briefings. The devastating conflict in Ukraine has dragged on for far too long, leaving a trail of destruction, human suffering, displaced families, and shattered lives and livelihoods of millions of people in its wake. We remain deeply concerned by the continued humanitarian and security consequences of this protracted conflict. We note with regret the recent escalation seen in fighting between the two sides, with a disproportionate impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure. Equally, if not more distressing, is the fact that the momentum for peace generated through arduous and bold diplomatic initiatives and negotiations facilitated by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, including the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2774 earlier this year and the limited ceasefire understandings, could not yield a lasting impact. The fragile foundation of hopes for peace laid down by the diplomatic efforts needs consolidation. Madam President, Pakistan is an ardent and resolute supporter of peace. We have always favored the path of diplomacy, dialogue, mediation, and engagement, and advocated for resolving disputes and differences through peaceful means. However, dialogue and diplomacy without a genuine commitment from all parties involved cannot deliver the desired results. As we have repeated on numerous occasions, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure is a fundamental obligation under international law and must be respected by all parties without exception. Military means will not resolve this conflict. The failure to seize the opportunities afforded by dialogue will only prolong the suffering of millions and exacerbate global instability. This serves no one's interest. Pakistan reiterates its firm belief that only meaningful dialogue and diplomacy can deliver sustainable peace. We welcome the direct talks between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, including agreements on prisoner exchanges, as steps in the right direction. However, these efforts are being overshadowed by the escalating violence, something that should be avoided at all costs. We remain hopeful that both parties would redouble their commitment to dialogue, build on the existing frameworks to achieve a durable ceasefire leading to a lasting solution. Madam President, Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has remained clear and consistent. From the outset, we have advocated for 1. Immediate de-escalation to prevent further loss of life. 2. Meaningful negotiations addressing mutual security concerns within the framework of the UN Charter. And 3. Inclusive and constructive diplomacy involving key regional and international stakeholders to pave the way for a just and lasting peace. In closing, Madam President, peace is an imperative, a humanitarian necessity, and the only path to avert pushing the world towards the brink of catastrophe. Pakistan reiterates its firm support for a peaceful resolution of this conflict and stands ready to back all efforts towards a peaceful resolution anchored in the principles of the UN Charter, international law, the relevant multilateral agreements, and which addresses the legitimate national security interests of all sides. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Panama would like to thank Guyana for convening this meeting in light of the serious and sustained deterioration of the situation in Ukraine resulting from an armed conflict which has had devastating humanitarian consequences, as we have already stated on repeated occasions in this Council. We're grateful for the detailed briefings prepared by Mr. Miroslav Jenka and Ms. Edem Wasornu, who provided valuable and substantive information about the situation on the ground. We're also grateful for and take note of the presence of the representatives of Ukraine, Lithuania, Germany, Norway, Italy, Poland, and the European Union. President, we're meeting today amidst an international context marked by a worrisome trend, the expansion of violent conflicts taking the place of diplomacy as the main means of resolving differences between states. This backsliding has weakened the fundamental norms of international law, eroding trust in the multilateral system and, in particular, in the credibility of this Council. Panama understands from its own experience the consequences of violations of international law and sovereignty. Hence, we unequivocally condemn all forms of aggression between states that threaten international peace and security. The international community cannot resign itself to normalizing war as a means of conflict resolution. The leadership required at this historic juncture demands courageous and consistent decisions aligned with the principles of the United Nations Charter. Panama recognizes the importance of maintaining open channels of communication between the parties. For this reason, we welcome the recent diplomatic efforts between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Nonetheless, these attempts cannot be seen as genuine if, at the same time, deliberate attacks against urban centers and critical civilian infrastructure are being intensified. The continuation of this offensive through the use of missiles and drones is a clear sign that there is still no real commitment to de-escalating the conflict. Sitting down to negotiate while the attacks continue undermines trust in any negotiation process. The first essential step towards peace is the effective cessation of hostilities. Without that basic commitment, any diplomatic effort will be doomed to fail. The protection of the civilian population must be central to all credible negotiations. In this regard, Panama firmly calls on the Russian Federation to accept a proposal for an immediate, verifiable, and sustainable proposal which would create true conditions to move towards a negotiated solution. Peace building demands political will, not rhetoric. It demands concrete steps that prioritize human life over and above the logic of destruction. President, respect for international law and international humanitarian law is not optional. It is an unavoidable duty both at times of peace and times of war. And it represents the minimum basis for civility among nations and the only guarantee that humanity will prevail even in the midst of a conflict. We reiterate that a just and lasting peace will only be possible in Ukraine if its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence are fully respected in accordance with the charter of this organization. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Shukran, Sayyida Rais.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Miroslav Jenka and Madam Edem Wasornu for their valuable briefings. Madam President, the situation in Ukraine continues to be critical as the military confrontation continues between Russia and Ukraine. The situation still threatens international peace and security and is deeply complex, necessarily negatively affecting any prospects for a breakthrough between the parties. The continued military operations continue, unfortunately, to claim innocent lives, including children and women. The humanitarian suffering continues to increase. The numbers of injured and displaced persons continue to rise, and they struggle to remain alive. The infrastructure is increasingly being destroyed, limiting persons' ability to remain resilient or to begin recovery. In this context, Algeria has always expressed and continues to express its deep concern as a result of the targeting of civilians and civilian infrastructure. Such targeting violates the rules of international law, including international humanitarian law. We must also mention that the impact of this war continues to negatively affect different regions of the world, in particular developing nations. Supply chains are disrupted, and the economic shocks are affecting food and energy markets, and continue to do so. Madam President, in this context, we would like to focus on the following points. 1. Algeria reiterates the need to prioritize the protection of civilians who bear the brunt of this war and who are most likely to suffer. We must guarantee the protection of civilian infrastructure, and we call for respecting the legal obligation to protect civilian infrastructure. Civilians must be spared from the cycle of violence and destruction. Second, we would also like to reiterate the need for the parties to commit to inclusive and constructive dialogue and to refrain from acts that undermine the prospects of a peaceful settlement. Further polarization will only fuel division and impede a political solution. We further call for an urgent resumption of dialogue and direct negotiations as the only path toward a sustained peace. On the contrary, warfare has proven its failure to achieve progress toward a ceasefire or a peaceful settlement. Third, we encourage the ongoing political and diplomatic efforts aimed at bridging the differences between the parties. We also reiterate our call on the international community to create the conducive conditions for negotiations and to facilitate constructive dialogue in a manner that guarantees the peaceful settlement and the continued consultations between the parties towards a lasting peace. In conclusion, Algeria reiterates its commitment to joint efforts in support of diplomacy and in pursuit of dialogue, understanding, consensus, and eventually a mutually acceptable, fair, and lasting peace. Such a path would be aligned with the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, and such a path must take into consideration the legitimate security concerns of the parties in order to maintain international peace and security. Thank you, Madam President.
Representative of Algeria for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Mr. Miroslav Jenka and OCHA Director Ms. Irene Wosono for their sobering briefings on the serious escalation of the Ukraine conflict. Sierra Leone is alarmed by reports of continuous strikes on heavily populated areas of Ukraine, including between 16th and 17th June, when 440 drones and numerous missiles struck residential buildings and other civilian infrastructure in the capital city of Kyiv. According to a letter addressed to the Council from the Permanent Representative of Ukraine, these attacks on Kyiv and other regions in Ukraine have resulted in numerous civilian deaths and injuries. The intensification of the conflict with the use of long-range missiles and loitering munitions in residential areas has had a devastating impact on civilians and civilian infrastructure. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has reported that at least 183 civilians were killed and 836 injured from Russian attacks in May. And this disturbing trend has continued into this month, with reported launching of over 1,500 long-range weapons into Ukraine since June 6th. Retaliatory attacks by Ukraine have also resulted in civilian deaths and injuries and infrastructural damage in Russia. We urge all parties to prioritize the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure to prevent further harm and ensure the restoration of essential services for the well-being and stability of the civilian populations. Madam President, today on World Refugee Day, we remember the millions of Ukrainian refugees scattered across Europe and other regions who have lost their homes and livelihoods in this conflict, with millions of people requiring life-saving assistance, including food and clean water. There is an urgent need to resolve this conflict. We urge both parties to actively engage in good faith negotiations. Talks facilitated by the United States, which have resulted in the exchange of prisoners of war, are a positive confidence-building measure that can be built upon. The recent exchanges of POWs, which have also included exchange of remains of soldiers, numbering over 6,000, are a sad reminder of the human cost of this conflict. It is imperative that direct talks between the parties address the possibility of an unconditional ceasefire as the starting point for a just and lasting peace. As dire as the situation seems, we maintain hope that the willingness both parties previously demonstrated will continue and they will engage in dialogue. Sierra Leone remains committed to supporting efforts towards a diplomatic solution to this conflict, noting that there are opportunities for good faith negotiations on a ceasefire at this very juncture. We call for the full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, and for the legitimate concerns of all parties to be taken into account. In closing, Madam President, we reiterate our call for increased funding support for humanitarian aid responses for civilians caught in this conflict. As this and other conflicts around the world intensify, so do the victims increase, and the need for the life-saving support provided by UN agencies and other humanitarian organizations. Let us honor the bravery of humanitarian workers who work tirelessly for a just and peaceful world, with many paying the ultimate price, and restore the dignity and rights of civilians by agreeing to a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, today we're once again witnessing a parade of European countries who once again intend to make their so-called invaluable contribution to the discussion, repeating identical narratives and statements and parading themselves in front of their TV streams. EU members, except Norway, of course, have a EU representative that could read a single agreed statement instead of wasting the Council's time on an endless repetition of the exact same meaningless thing. It is time to put an end to this practice. The meetings convened by the Western states on Ukraine is not an open debate, and this EU chorus here is excessive and unnecessary. Madam President, our world is changing rapidly. However, some things remain unchanged. One of them is the obstinate persistence of our European colleagues in certain matters. Instead of the situation in Gaza or the looming large-scale regional war due to Israel's reckless attack on Iran or other pressing crises, they insist on calling a meeting of the Security Council to discuss the situation in Ukraine. Their main goal in this also remains unchanged: to tarnish Russia at any cost and to try to sustain the now completely unconvincing narrative of Ukraine as the innocent victim and Russia as the treacherous aggressor. London, Paris, Brussels, and Berlin are not even bothering to search for ways to resolve the Ukrainian crisis. Their interest lies solely in prolonging the conflict as much as possible to bleed Russia dry. In this, they are fully aligned with the priorities of the Ukrainian expired princeling, who understands that peace in Ukraine would mean the end of his personal power and his ability to rob his country blind. nor does he want to be held responsible for embezzling billions of dollars of Western aid and budget funds stolen from his fellow citizens. And so we are once again forced to listen to fairy tales about big bag imperialist Russia and be distracted by disinformation and outright lies. The formal pretext for all Western meetings on Ukraine is the accusation that Russia is allegedly targeting civilians, although the evidence points to the contrary. Today, the pretext is a downed missile hitting the entrance to an apartment building in Kyiv, which the Zelensky regime is desperately trying to portray as a deliberate Russian strike. However, much to the consternation of the stage actor in Kyiv, as was the case on many previous occasions, videos shot by ordinary citizens have already surfaced online exposing the false claims of the Ukrainian authorities and their Western backers. People are now openly mocking these new, unconvincing attempts of the Kyiv junta's ringleader and asking why such tragedies always seem to occur right before his foreign trips. This time, the Ukrainian air defense acted in this criminal manner on the eve of his trip to the summit of the so-called G7. Other videos exist clearly showing that Russian strikes were aimed solely at military targets or objects directly related to Ukraine's military capabilities. In Kyiv, military industrial facilities, air defense systems, military warehouses, and security force gathering points were hit on this day. Similar sites were being targeted by the missile that was shot down by Ukrainian air defense systems located in residential areas in violation of international humanitarian law. These strikes also destroyed ammunition depots and an airport housing Western Patriot air defense systems, resulting in powerful explosions, a secondary detonation, and a fire, which are also clearly visible in videos posted online by Ukrainian users. The National Aviation Institute in Kyiv was also hit for the clear reason that a so-called Ukrainian volunteer had boasted on social media about storing drones for the Ukrainian armed forces in a building in the heart of a residential area, including photos in his post. Colleagues, using civilians as human shields has now become a trademark of the Ukrainian armed forces. Thus, recent online footage from Kupiansk clearly shows Ukrainian forces using apartment buildings and private homes to deploy drone units. And the Spanish newspaper El País recently reported on assembly shops in residential buildings where soldiers convert civilian devices received from the government or private individuals into offensive weapons. Madam President, the deceitful statements of our Western colleagues are accompanied by their deliberate silence on the crimes of Ukrainian armed forces against civilians in Russian regions, yet there is much to discuss here. Unlike the precise strikes by the Russian aerospace forces against Ukrainian military targets, Ukrainian forces have long been known to target residential areas and use people as human shields. In the past week alone, from June 9 to 15, there were 104 civilian casualties as a result of shelling by Ukrainian Nazis. 96 were injured, including 14 minors, and 8 killed, including 1 minor. Over 1,600 munitions were fired at civilian targets in Russian territories by the Ukrainian armed forces, and dozens, if not hundreds, of drones are launched daily at civilian objects in Russia. The glaring silence, inaction, and sometimes direct or tacit approval from some European countries effectively encourages the Kyiv regime to escalate further. As a result, we see their methods increasingly take on the characteristics of organized terror against civilians and civilian objects. A stark example of these terrorist methods are the targeted attacks on passenger trains in the Bryansk, Kursk, and Voronezh regions of Russia on May 31st, June 1st, and June 5th, resulting in 7 civilian deaths and over 100 injured. In connection with this, we proposed a Security Council draft resolution condemning these terrorist acts. Western states took a blatantly cynical stance on this and refused to condemn these clearly terrorist actions. They went so far as to block a standard Council's statement on sympathy for the victims. Instead of condemning terrorism, they tried to portray blowing up a passenger train as a legitimate military target, which is not only inhumane but also contrary to international law. This position demonstrates dangerous politicization, whereby the fight against terrorism becomes a tool to apply double standards rather than a universal principle. In addition, we have once again seen that the West, rabid with Russophobia, sees nothing wrong with the killing of Russian citizens. If it were American, British, or French citizens, their actions would be completely different. The terrorist acts committed by Kiev should be viewed in a broader context. There is no doubt that this series of terrorist acts, as well as the FPV drone attacks on strategic aviation airfields in Murmansk, Irkutsk, Ivanovo, Ryazan, and Amur regions on June 1st, were intended to disrupt the second round of peace talks on June 2nd in Istanbul and provoke our government to respond with large-scale retaliatory actions, which could have been used to solicit new handouts from the West. However, Kiev's plan fell through, and our delegation arrived on the scheduled day in Istanbul. During the direct Russian-Ukrainian talks that were held, we presented our memorandum on a peaceful settlement. It consists of two parts: conditions for a comprehensive long-term peace and conditions for a ceasefire. The memorandum is based on the fundamental principles outlined by the President of the Russian Federation in June 2024, which we have repeatedly discussed, including in this chamber. This is the best offer Ukraine can get today. We advise accepting it, as things will only get worse for Kiev from here on out. In Istanbul, we also agreed on a large-scale exchange of prisoners of war, starting with the wounded, gravely ill, and those under 25. In addition, we handed over the bodies of more than 6,000 deceased Ukrainian soldiers to Kiev. This humanitarian gesture put the Kiev regime in a bind, as the high number of bodies reveals the true scale of losses of Ukrainian armed forces on the front, and compensation has to be paid out to the families of the deceased. For this reason, Zelensky and his clique refused to collect the bodies for several days under false pretenses. However, after we published the corresponding lists, they were left with no choice. As a result, 6,060 bodies of deceased Ukrainian soldiers were handed over to the Ukrainian side, and we are ready to hand over another 2,239 bodies. The bodies of 78 deceased Russian soldiers were received from Ukraine. Mr. President, during the second round of talks in Istanbul, the issue of children was also discussed. Contrary to bombastic claims about tens of thousands of kidnapped children spread not only by Western countries but also by reputable international organizations who evidently do not cherish their reputation, the list provided by Kiev contains 339 names. This clearly shows just how much this sensitive issue has been exaggerated and transformed into a political propaganda spectacle. We note again that in reality there are no mass deportations or so-called abductions of children, but rather the evacuation of children from combat zones by authorized Russian bodies. Many of these children have already been returned to their homes. Of course, all the information relayed to us will be studied, and if it is confirmed, the children will be returned to their families. Madam President, from the very beginning of the special military operation, Russia has remained open to dialogue and finding ways to address the root causes of the Ukrainian crisis peacefully. We reaffirm this position today. The only thing that can still save Ukraine from complete disaster is to immediately proceed with constructive and realistic negotiations, the next round of which we propose holding in Istanbul after June 22nd. We appreciate the consistent support of our American colleagues for our direct talks with Ukraine. We hope that the European sponsors of Kiev regime will, instead of doing their utmost to facilitate continuing the war until the last Ukrainian, will give it a chance at survival instead. Thank you.
Of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
President, I thank ASG Yencha and Director Vosono for the briefings. Recently, Russia and Ukraine held a second round of direct negotiation in Istanbul, and reached consensus on issues such as the exchange of seriously injured soldiers, the remains of fallen soldiers, and assisting separated children in returning to their families. Currently, relevant work is being facilitated. China welcomes these positive developments, encourages both sides to hold a new round of negotiation, and supports all efforts for peace. At the same time, China is deeply saddened and concerned about Russia and Ukraine's continued large-scale drone and missile attacks against each other, which has caused heavy civilian casualties and infrastructure damages on both sides. As an old Chinese saying goes, a 3-foot-thick ice does not form overnight. The Ukrainian crisis has dragged on, involving complex and intertwined conflicts, and affects the vital interests of all parties involved. Achieving a ceasefire and restoring peace is not easy, and still requires sustained and relentless efforts from the international community. I would like to emphasize 3 points. First, every effort must be made to protect civilians. Civilians, especially women and children, are the biggest victims of war. Parties to conflicts should strictly comply with IHL and avoid attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure under any circumstances. Second, it is essential to sustain the momentum of peace talks. Lasting solutions to end conflicts are ultimately achieved through negotiation. China supports all parties concerned in maintaining contact, continuing negotiations, showing political wills and mutual flexibility, and reach a fair, lasting, binding peace agreement accepted by all through dialogue and consultation. Third, favorable conditions should be established. The international community should advocate more rationally for a ceasefire while promoting peace talks and dialogue. Greater diplomatic efforts are needed to build trust and facilitate mediation, thereby fostering a constructive environment for an early political resolution to the crisis. In this context, we urge the United States to focus on diplomatic efforts and stop its groundless accusations. Mr. President, China's position on the Ukrainian issue has been consistent, firm, and clear. We always stand on the side of peace, dialogue, and humanity, and support a ceasefire and a political solution. We actively carry out diplomatic mediation in accordance with the 4 shoulds proposed by President Xi Jinping, and have initiated the Friends of Peace group with Brazil and other global south to call for peace, build consensus on peace, and promote peace efforts. China stands ready to work with the international community to continue to play a constructive role in promoting an early political solution to the crisis. I thank you.
Representative of China for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, at the outset, I wish to thank ASG Yanka and Director Osorno for their valuable briefings and for their updates on the developments in Ukraine. The Security Council meets again at a moment of heightened tensions. The recent escalations is deeply troubling, not only for its immediate impact on civilians, but also for its wider implications for international peace and security. We welcome the recent exchange of prisoners of war. This is an encouraging sign of dialogue and a reminder that even amid conflict, humanitarian gestures remain possible. We urge the parties to build on this progress in line with international humanitarian law. However, the humanitarian situations continue to deteriorate. Civilians are bearing the brunt. Families are displaced. Infrastructure is damaged, and access to essential services is shrinking. The upcoming winter threatens to worsen these hardships for the most vulnerable population. We urge all parties to comply with international humanitarian law and ensure unhindered humanitarian access and prioritize the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. At this juncture, we appeal for de-escalation and the utmost restraint by all sides. The cycle of violence must end. We call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire as a vital first step to halt the deepening crisis. Yet a ceasefire alone is not enough. There must be a genuine return to dialogue and diplomacy. Only through constructive engagement and a renewed commitment to negotiations can a just and lasting peace take root. The Council must encourage and support all efforts toward a diplomatic solution guided by the principles of the United Nations Charter. Our delegations remain steadfast in our commitment to a peaceful, stable, and sovereign Ukraine and to the pursuit of a just and lasting peace for its people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. I thank ASG Yancha and OCHA Director Wosurnu for their briefs. I also welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Ukraine in this meeting and other regional countries. Guyana notes with alarm the intensifying attacks and mounting civilian casualties reported over the last few days and weeks in this conflict. We regret that the growing demands for a ceasefire and efforts to arrive at an urgent diplomatic solution remain elusive. Meanwhile, the lives of innocent men, women, and children in both Ukraine and Russia continue to be cut short, and the livelihoods of many upended. Colleagues, with rising global tensions and conflicts reaching the highest levels since World War II, one truth has become clear. The world is witnessing a collapse in the international frameworks and mechanisms that were designed to protect civilians in armed conflicts. As conflict parties remain locked in a win-lose scenario where one must prevail and the other must be defeated, it is innocent civilians who continue to suffer the consequences of their decisions and actions. As ASG Yancha said, new data published by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights this month indicate that civilian deaths in conflicts surged 40% globally in 2024, with children dying in unprecedented numbers. Other alarming statistics from the report show that one civilian dies in armed conflict every 12 minutes, while every 14 hours, at least one human rights defender, journalist, or trade unionist is killed or disappeared. In Ukraine, the worrying trend of high civilian casualties in 2025, with the first 5 months of the year being almost 50% higher than in the same period in 2024, is of deep concern. In May alone, there were at least 183 civilian deaths and 836 injuries in Ukraine. These casualties stem largely from attacks with long-range missiles, loitering munitions, and short-range drones with onboard high-resolution cameras used for precision targeting. These are all weapons that continue to cause grave civilian harm. Guyana reiterates its demand for the parties to this conflict to respect humanitarian principles and adhere to international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We urge greater efforts to ensure the protection of civilians and civilian objects, and for this to be made a critical priority in the planning and conduct of military operations. We reiterate our call for an immediate end to the hostilities. We also call, once again, for respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Guyana urges the parties to engage in good faith in the diplomatic efforts underway and commends the efforts of UN agencies, bilateral partners, and international, regional, and local organizations in this regard. These diplomatic efforts have led to the exchange of prisoners and other detained persons. We hope that these will continue and urge greater attention to confidence-building measures. We further call for independent monitors, including OHCHR, to be allowed regular, unimpeded, and confidential access to all detained persons. In closing, Guyana stresses the urgency of resolving this conflict through peaceful means. We will continue to support all efforts of the United Nations Secretary-General and other willing partners who have been working diligently toward peace and an end to this war. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, I wish to thank the Guyana Presidency, and in particular Ambassador Rodriguez Birkett, for convening today's Urgent Security Council meeting, and Denmark, Greece, France, the Republic of Korea, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom for supporting Ukraine's request. I'm also grateful to the briefers, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenča and OCHA Director Vosornu, for their thoughtful insights and a very clear-cut position. Today I speak before you not only as a representative of Ukraine, a victim of Russia's war of annihilation. Today I stand as a citizen, as a son whose family's life back home in Kiev, like the lives of millions of other Ukrainian families, hangs by a thin thread, never knowing if Russia's next shelling will cut it. For over 3 years, my mother-in-law, a gentle and resilient woman, has endured countless nights punctured by the hail of drones and the thunder of Russian missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, Iranian Shahed drone, which turned into winged nightmares. Night after night, the sky above Kiev and many other peaceful cities has turned into a deadly hunting ground. But especially during the last months, my mom, like countless other Ukrainians, has been spending every single night, together with my little niece, in a bathroom. Because the way to the closest bomb shelter in the metro station is far more perilous than hiding at home. Because it is the only place that might offer a fragile shield against death from above, against the shards of glass that shatter from every window when explosions shake my home city. But just days ago, on the 17th of June, the darkness was ripped apart yet again, this time on an unprecedented scale, marking perhaps the most dreadful night of this barbaric war. A single Russian X-101 cruise missile struck deep into a residential building as innocent families lay asleep in the gentle embrace of dreams. 23 souls, mothers, fathers, children, were ripped from life in the blink of an eye. A whole section of this apartment block was obliterated, literally. In the span of a single heartbeat, their pillows became their burial shroud. That very night, seconds after this deadly strike, my mom called me. She lives only a whisker away from the house in the Solominsky district that was hit. Her voice, fragile and quivering, bridged the void between us. And she said, "The walls are trembling, the windows are rattling. I'm praying, my son. I do not know if I will ever see your face again." That horrible night, my mother and our family were spared by nothing by a stroke of luck in a moment of this endless terror. Yet the shadow of that danger still looms over all us, a cruel reminder that the sword of Damocles is suspended above our heads, knowing it might fall at any time. Can you, distinguished members of this council, can you imagine this? Can you imagine your own mother whispering what could be her last prayer over the phone as the ceiling about her threatens to become her grave? This is not a war fought in trenches. This Russian war is waged in bedrooms. This Russian war is a war in kitchens, war in playgrounds, war in hospitals, in schools. This is pure terror that never sleeps, terror that steals tomorrow before the dawn can break. This madness has to stop. And yet, on the very same day, like today, last Monday, when 440 murderous drones and 32 ballistic and cruise missiles with cluster ammunition struck Kiev, killing in total 28 innocent people in their sleep and leaving over 140 wounded, our Russian colleague shamelessly declared, like he did today, with a straight face, that Russia does not target civilians. If it wasn't Russia shelling our homes, then who else could it be? aliens from the outer space, or perhaps Darth Vader and his Death Star. Maybe next time they'll blame Martians, the dark side of the Force, or the Tooth Fairy, dropping bombs instead of coins. But we all know the bitter truth. We know it. These attacks come from a single source, from a very single source. And that is Putin's decision to terrorize civilians in Ukraine simply because his army cannot win and will not win on the battlefield. Distinguished members of this Council, I speak here today not to exchange accusations, not to hurl arrows back and forth, and not to dance to the tune our Russian counterparts keep playing shamelessly again in this chamber. I'm here to remind us of the responsibility this Council holds to protect peace and not merely rehearse endless arguments. I believe that even the smallest steps are better than yet another round of blame games that we have seen so often here in this chamber. Our main goal is simple. It is very simple: to stop this horrible and bloody war. And this Council must never lose sight of that. One of the greatest dangers that we face is the slow poison of getting accustomed to this Russian war. What we have heard today, the creeping notion that it has become routine, hopeless, or somehow impossible to end because this Council so often remains deadlocked. War fatigue may be human, but tolerating daily war crimes, as we have seen in Ukraine, must never be an option. We cannot, and this Council must not allow ourselves to grow used to this war against Ukraine, treating it as background noise to other global conflicts. We cannot allow cynicism to replace responsibility. Every missile strike, every child killed, every family forced to flee is a reminder that this brutal Russian war must never be filed away as yesterday's news. It remains this Council's duty to prove that even amid deadlock, it is still possible to break through and move forward, however slowly, toward ending the bloodshed. We all need more courage. We all need more creative thinking, also in this chamber. Let us remember why we gather here beneath the emblem of the United Nations. Because the Security Council still bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace. This is not just a provision enshrined in Article 24 of the Charter. It is above all a solemn commitment and a moral contract with all of humanity. When that contract is betrayed, trust in the very idea of a rules-based international order is shattered as well. Today, I speak before you with a plea, with one simple plea that transcends Ukraine's tragedy, but one that echoes the universal, timeless aspirations of humanity. Help us end this nightmare once and for all. Use this authority entrusted to you by every nation that has signed the UN Charter. We urge this Council to live up to its founding promise and to take bold, decisive and urgent action to secure an immediate, comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire for at least 30 or better 60 days. A ceasefire that will hush the drones, ground the missiles, and give mothers the right to sleep without praying they and our children will survive the night. It has now been, as many colleagues have just mentioned, over 101 days since Ukraine committed itself to such a ceasefire. Regrettably, Russia has chosen to dismiss this path towards silencing the guns. Moscow has chosen to turn its back not only on Ukraine's offer, but also on the tireless peace efforts of our American friends, of President Donald Trump personally, who have worked relentlessly to create space for diplomatic solution. This Council should not look away from this truth. There is no lack of willingness for peace on the Ukrainian side, only a lack of honesty from those who keep launching the deadly missiles. I dare to hope, and I invite all of you to share that hope with me today, that in the next days that lie ahead, this Council will consider and adopt a resolution calling for an end of these attacks, a very simple resolution that would demand full, immediate, unconditional ceasefire, and which would lay the ground for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with the UN Charter. Let my mother and millions of mothers like her lie down at night knowing that the international community has not abandoned them and has not turned away from their suffering. Let the world witness that the Security Council is not a relic of old promises, but a living guardian of our shared peace and our common dignity. And before I leave this chamber, I wish to extend an official invitation to the members of this council to pay a visit to Ukraine. Please come and walk our bombed, ravaged streets, stand beside the dark craters where children once played, talk to the victims, hear with your own ears the wail of the sirens that steal our sleep every night, look into the eyes of mothers who tuck their kids into basements instead of beds, smell the smoke of ruins, touch the rubbles, feel the chill of war. Madam President, distinguished members of this Council, this chamber is often called the most important room in the world. On the walls just behind us, we can see and we can admire a masterpiece by the Norwegian artist Per Krogh. The phoenix at its center shall always remind us that peace must rise from the ashes, but it will not rise on its own. It is this Council that must breathe life into it, in Ukraine and in many, many, many other countries around the world, plagued by the scourge of war. I thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. I thank the Guyana presidency for calling this meeting and appreciate the information provided by the distinguished briefers, Assistant Secretary General Miroslav Jenča and the OCHA Director Eden Wosorno. We reiterate our full support to the UN humanitarian agencies and volunteers assisting Ukraine. The Baltic states are active participants in the UN regional refugee response and contributors to the humanitarian needs and response plan. We strongly condemn Russia's brutal attack on the Kiev this Tuesday, which killed at least 23 and injured over 134 civilians, including children, marking one of the deadliest strikes in the nearly a year, as documented by UN Human Rights Team. Attacks targeting civilian infrastructure are direct violations of international humanitarian law. This attack is in a broader pattern of the deliberately cynical terrorist campaigns by Russia against Ukrainian civilians and critical infrastructure, campaigns that have recently intensified, with Ukraine enduring daily barrages of Russian missile and drone strikes. Day after day, Russia's military, armed by Belarus, DPRK, and Iran, kill and maim peaceful civilians across Ukraine. Russia's war is further enabled by the state profiteers, which supply Russia dual-use technologies and maintain its so-called shadow fleet of oil tankers. We continue to urge China, as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, with a particular responsibility to upholding the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, to exercise its influence to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and to increase pressure to force Russia to peace in Ukraine by agreeing with the ceasefire. Let me remind that today marks 101 days since Ukraine agreed with the US proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. Meanwhile, Russia is spreading disinformation about its readiness to speak peace, aiming at buying time and continuing its aggression. Russia rejects even a basic 30-day ceasefire, which must be a precondition for any future peace negotiations on the conclusion of a just and lasting peace agreement, proving once again that Russia doesn't want peace. Our response must be resolute, pressure on Russia, and maximize support to Ukraine. Peace cannot be negotiated while missiles and drones rain down on the Ukrainian people. Moreover, Russia disseminates ever-changing narratives about the causes of war. Yet we know that Russia attacked, invaded, occupied territories of Ukraine unprovoked, in the tradition of its long-standing imperialistic policies, which Russia prefers to accuse others of. Madam President, the Baltic states will continue speaking against Russia's propaganda at the UN. We will also do our utmost to bring a conclusive and irreversible end to Russia's aggression. There is no justification for military invasion of another country. Ukraine has an undeniable right to defend itself, and we will do everything in our power to assist Ukraine. Accountability is also not optional. We will also hold Russia and its accomplices accountable for their actions. Impunity only breeds future generations of war criminals. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine has concluded that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in Ukraine. We therefore demand full accountability for all the crimes perpetrated by Russia in Ukraine. The work done by the Register of Damage, as well as the European Court of Human Rights, will be crucial for achieving full accountability and ensuring justice for victims of Russia's brutal war. While war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide are prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, the crime of aggression can only be prosecuted by the Special Tribunal, which has our strong support. The Baltic states expressed their unwavering support to Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We call for increased joint international pressure to force Russia into peace in Ukraine. Russia must immediately stop murdering innocent civilians, withdraw all its armed forces and military equipment from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, in full compliance with the international law, including the UN Charter, and cease its aggression once and for all. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Madam President, thank you for giving me the floor. And thanks also for the very valuable briefings provided by DPPA and OCHA. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Sweden, and my own country, Norway. Allow me to remind this Council, whose primary mandate is to maintain international peace and security, that the sole responsibility for the brutal war unfolding in Ukraine lies on the aggressor, the Russian Federation. These past weeks, Russia has launched large and intensified waves of drone and missile attacks against Ukraine, causing unbearable suffering. No target is off limits for Russia, not even a maternity ward in Odessa or the UNESCO-listed St. Sophia Cathedral. The attacks involve both drones and ballistic missiles, and they last 4 hours. Last weekend's attack in Kiev, killing at least 28 civilians and injuring more than 140 residents, marks the deadliest attack against the capital in nearly a year. This underscores the devastating trend of increasing civilian casualties. Madam President, Russia's armed forces and those supporting them have committed acts or threats of violence for the primary purpose of spreading terror among the civilian population, in violation of international humanitarian law, and this has been documented by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. The situation for Ukrainians living under Russian occupation is alarming. We call for full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access in occupied territories. We urge Russia to comply with international humanitarian law and allow humanitarian personnel to have access to prisoners of war, including those held captive in Russia. Madam President, time and time again and consistently, Ukraine has demonstrated its desire for peace. Peace can only be sustainable if Ukraine is at the table and its right to decide its own future is fully respected. Ukraine has no choice but to continue to fight for its sovereignty and its very existence, to uphold its legitimate right of defending itself against Russian aggression. Russia, on the other hand, has a choice. Russia could end its suffering, it could end this war today, by withdrawing all forces from occupied territory, end all hostilities, release all prisoners, and return all children unlawfully deported from Ukraine. However, the continued attacks against civilians demonstrate that Russia's objectives are unchanged. Russia's current maximalist demands of political and territorial control over Ukraine are completely unacceptable and incompatible with Ukraine's sovereignty. Madam President, we support Ukraine's position that the first step must be a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire. A ceasefire needed to prevent further loss of innocent lives. The Nordic countries remain steadfast in their support to Ukraine. We remain committed to strengthening Ukraine as well as to upholding sanctions targeting Russia's war economy. Madam President, Russia's war threatens not only European security, it also has global implications. We urge all countries to immediately cease any direct or indirect assistance to Russia in its war of aggression against Ukraine. We urge all members of this Council to act in accordance with the rules and principles of the UN Charter. This includes respect for any state's territorial integrity and internationally recognized borders. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Norway for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Germany.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the statement to be delivered by the European Union. At the outset, allow me to join others in thanking the briefers for their important contributions. Madam President, on Monday, while the world was watching the escalation in the Middle East, Russian forces launched one of the most devastating airstrikes on Kiev since the start of the war, causing extensive destruction of civilian infrastructure. As we know, at least 28 people were killed and over 140 injured. This is yet another sign that Russia is using diplomacy as a facade. Russia is sidestepping, dragging its feet, and keeps pushing its maximalist demands. Russia does not want a just and lasting diplomatic solution, but Ukraine's unconditional surrender. This is also evident in the memorandum presented in Istanbul. Recently, the Deputy Chairman of the Security Council of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, acknowledged that the Istanbul talks were not aimed at striking a compromise for peace, but for ensuring a swift victory for Russia. Let me be clear, it is the Russian Federation which is fighting an illegal and unprovoked war of territorial expansion against its sovereign neighbor. We, on the contrary, are supporting Ukraine's legitimate right to defend itself against an act of aggression. Together with Ukraine, we are heeding the unequivocal call of the General Assembly and the Secretary General to work towards a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in Ukraine, a peace rooted in the UN Charter and international law. As we and many others have raised before in this chamber, how the war ends does matter, not only to Ukraine and Europe, but to every member state of this organization. We must avoid at all costs that the aggressor is rewarded for its aggression. In a world where might replaces right, the security of all nations is eroded, threatening us all. Germany, Europe, and above all Ukraine want this war to end, and we want it to end now. Ukraine has demonstrated its willingness and commitment to accept a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire without preconditions months ago. How much longer must we wait for Russia to show it is truly ready for peace? We will continue to work with partners to increase the pressure for Russia to negotiate in earnest. When we call on Russia to engage, we mean true and genuine engagement for a full, unconditional ceasefire as the first step toward peace, immediately and without further preconditions. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Germany for her statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Italy.
Madam President, Italy fully aligns itself with the statement to be delivered by the European Union and would like to add some considerations in its national capacity. We are convinced today, after the most recent brutal Russian attacks in Ukraine, a clear further breach of international law. This demonstrates once again the urgent need for an immediate ceasefire as a precondition to launch meaningful negotiations for peace. Only a diplomatic solution to the conflict based on the UN Charter and the international law with the full involvement of Ukraine and Europe can lead to a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. We firmly believe that the full implementation of these principles is not only in the interest of Ukraine and Europe, but of the entire UN membership, and above all, is in the interest of the innocent civilians who are the main victims of a war they did not ask for. We welcome all efforts towards achieving such a peace, including last week's exchange of prisoners. Ukraine has demonstrated its willingness to pursue peace with a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire and high-level negotiations. The focus of the international community is now on what steps are necessary to bring Russia to the negotiating table with a real political will to end the war. As we said many times, we are not at war with Russia and the Russian people. We are opposing an ill-considered and unprovoked decision to invade a sovereign country. Unwavering support for independence, sovereignty, and the territorial integrity of Ukraine has been a priority for Italy since the beginning of the conflict. While strongly backing the European Union initiatives, Italy is contributing in particular to ensure Ukraine's resilience and intends to play an active role in the social and economic recovery of the country, as well as its reconstruction. We will host on July 10 and 11 in Rome the Ukraine Recovery Conference focused on 4 key thematic pillars: business, human, regional, and EU dimension. Together, we will lay the foundations for a prosperous, independent Ukraine within our common European family. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Italy for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, head of the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Madam President, and I would like to thank the briefers for sharing their assessment of the consequences of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Let me begin by reiterating a point that we have made time and again. Violations of the Charter have to be condemned by any members and by all members of the international community in unequivocal terms. In the case of Ukraine, this means reiterating our resolute condemnation of Russia's illegal, unprovoked, and unjustified war of aggression, which is yet another blatant violation of the Charter and international law by Russia. Russia's war comes with dramatic and unpredictable consequences beyond Ukraine, of course. We've discussed this many times in this chamber. But its destructive impact on Ukraine itself, the victim, has been particularly vast in scale and gravity. In its latest report, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission has noted a further increase in civilian casualties over April and May. The aggression has caused over 46,000 civilian casualties. Over 46,000 civilian casualties, as verified by the United Nations. The EU therefore continues to condemn, in the strongest possible terms, the atrocities committed in Ukraine by Russia in the context of its war of aggression. These include indiscriminate and targeted attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure, extrajudicial executions, including summary executions of prisoners of war and civilian detainees, the systematic and widespread use of torture and other forms of ill treatment, including sexual and gender-based violence, and unlawful deportation and forcible transfer of Ukrainian children and other civilians. Colleagues, Russia could end its war now. It could accept a full and unconditional ceasefire, as Ukraine has. And it could most certainly simply end its unprovoked war today. As in the past, it is now for Russia to show its willingness to achieve peace. Madam President, let me once again underline our resolute determination to put an end to Russia's war of aggression and to achieve lasting peace. As Europeans, together with Ukraine, we have been working tirelessly to this end, and we welcome all efforts in that direction. We have joined Ukraine and international partners, including the United States, in calling for a full unconditional ceasefire of at least 30 days. This pause in hostilities could serve as a vital step towards reducing civilian suffering and allow for further exchanges of prisoners and critically, for the return of children. Ukraine has demonstrated its willingness to accept a comprehensive and immediate ceasefire without preconditions. It has committed to such a step 100 days ago. For 100 days, Russia has refused to commit. It has, by contrast, further escalated its attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. On Tuesday night, as many mentioned in this room, Ukraine reported over 440 Russian drones and over 30 missiles striking densely populated residential areas, including the capital, Kyiv. These are not the actions of a country suing for peace. Madam President, we implore the Council to exert increased pressure for a full and unconditional ceasefire as a first step. It would provide space for meaningful talks aimed at ending Russia's war and achieving a comprehensive, just and lasting peace grounded in the principles of the UN Charter and international law. Again, Russia can also end this war if it ceases its aggression and withdraws all forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine, immediately, completely, unconditionally, exactly what it has been refusing to do for 3 years plus. Russia has itself to fully respect Ukraine's territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders if it claims that it cares about the Charter. The European Union is firmly committed to ensuring full accountability for all international crimes and human rights violations committed, as well as victims' rights to justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition. And until Russia ends its war of aggression, we stress again that Ukraine has an inherent right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. Russia is the aggressor. Ukraine is defending itself, its territory, its people, its freedom, its statehood, its existence. The facts are irrefutable. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, I want to start by thanking Guyana for convening this timely and important discussion, and thank the briefers for the updates provided. Poland aligns itself with the statement just delivered by the European Union. It is deplorable that more than 3 years from launching its full-scale aggression against Ukraine, Russia shows no genuine interest in ending its brutal war. While Ukraine has proposed an unconditional ceasefire as a prerequisite for wider peace talks, and the world supported this notion, Russia continues to escalate its demands, amounting to Ukraine's capitulation, and unashamedly boasts of plans to seize more Ukrainian land. The cornerstone of those demands is the resolution of what Russia calls the root causes of the conflict. And we concur. The root causes of this war, which have to be resolved, are Russia's neocolonial aspirations, which constitute a threat to peace and stability of Ukraine, Europe, and the entire UN system. Just earlier today in St. Petersburg, President Putin said or claimed that, I quote, "all Ukraine is ours." Kremlin is hoping to restore the Soviet times when Kyiv was subordinated and Ukraine had no free will and right to decide on its future. But as we see every day, Ukrainian determination to resist Russia is stronger than the aggressor's missiles. Russia's actions demonstrate that it sees peace talks as an inconsequential sideshow. Its military campaign in Ukraine has intensified significantly, with 2025 well on track to become the deadliest year for Russian forces since the beginning of the full-scale war. Ukraine has the unquestionable right to defend itself, including by targeting aggressors' military assets. Poland will continue to stand with the victim of the aggression, just as we have done since day one. We will also continue supporting Ukraine in seeking a genuine, just, and lasting peace based on the UN Charter and international law, in line with the will of Ukraine's citizens. That is what we all should support. Madam President, in his attempt to resuscitate the Russian Empire and to feed his personal ambition, perhaps, President Putin has already sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives of its own citizens and robbed them of a peaceful and prosperous future. It is time for Russia to end this war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.